Discover the career of your dreams. Learn how to get your foot in the door, stand out, and create the life you desire. This is our time. This is our adventure. Together, you and I will explore the world, discover what's possible, and eradicate wasted potential from existence. I'm Siobhan Colleen. This is Industry Explorers. Welcome to an episode of Industry Explorers. Today we have a diversity and inclusion strategist and consultant who is passionate about creating companies where millennials want to work. Our guest has a doctorate in leadership and global perspectives, which, with copious amounts of research, gives her the ability to approach diversity and inclusion from anthropological, theological, sociological, and ethnographical perspectives. For over 20 years, she has presented talks on generational differences, racial justice, LGBTQIA+ inclusion, and the necessity for generational education within all sectors of corporate, nonprofit, and government. She was named an Emerging Leader Under 40 by the NYC Mayor's Center for Faith and Community Partnership, gave her PechaKucha presentation on diversity and inclusion at Oxford University, and consulted with Thrivent Financials and numerous nonprofits and corporations. She's been published and featured in MSN, Entrepreneur, Thrive Global, Lifehack, LinkedIn, George Fox University, QARA, The Good Men Project, 30 Days of Hope, Andy's Pandemic Podcast, Missy Show, Loud Conversations, I'll Go First, Repurposed, and She Owns It. Please welcome Dr. Colleen Batchelder. Yeah! Oh my God, you're amazing. You've done so much. Like, your introduction, I can't wait to unpack all of this. This is like, how do you get to where you are today? You're so accomplished. First, how are you today?
Thank you so much. As I was listening to that, I'm like, no wonder I am buying so much hair dye out of Walmart so much, because I'm like, all the gray hair just sort of comes through.
with each accomplishment.
Yeah, exactly. But I love it. I love to stay busy. I've always been a very type A personality. I am an ENTJ to the core. So when this pandemic hit, my first reaction was, how do I be productive? How do I sort of, figure out this pivot and what to learn from it and where to go?
Well, I'm really excited to learn what your journey has been. So when you were in middle school and high school, what did you want to do when you graduated?
Something totally different than what I'm doing now. I started out loving Broadway. I mean, my favorite show growing up with Guys and Dolls. And I wanted to be Adelaide like no one's business. So I knew that song to a core. I could quote it verbatim. And it was just my heart song. I felt like it was the character of me incarnate. And I just dreamt of being on the stage, having those stage lights, and just entering into new adventures with every single show. I got to experience that in professional theater. When I was 16 years old, I joined a theater called Surflight, which is right on Long Beach Island in New Jersey. And it was great because I was interacting and acting with equity players and people who had been on Broadway. And so at 16 years old, you're sitting in this massive creative bubble. And it was a blast. For me as a high schooler, it was just an absolute blast. And then from there, I went to City Opera. So at 18 years old, I packed my bags, had my first foreign adventure, and I studied with actually Maria Callas's coach out in Italy. So it was such an amazing experience.
I just can't even imagine being 16, 18 years old and being in professional theater. You're speaking my language right there. I also like Guys and Dolls, and, I went to college for theater. But when you were doing it professionally, how did you get that opportunity?
It was almost like a solution to my timidity. I know everybody listening and probably watching now, it would laugh at the fact of thinking that I was shy, but I was very shy. And I decided to join theater to kind of work on my improv, work on my, getting to things faster, to have that quickness of speech. And I would just ponder, and I would sit there and think for hours, but I would never express what I was thinking and what I was feeling. And so theater really started out as almost like a therapeutic experience to me. And then after that, I was just hooked. So it was a way for me to escape what I was then and really journey to be who I was now. I remember my coach, my theater coach at that time saying, you need to mix who you are on stage with who you are off stage and figure out how to really step into that confidence. So I blame theater fully for getting me to the place of sort of just owning who I am and just that freedom where a lot of people are still walking around insecure. But I had that feeling of, wait a minute, I can flub on stage. I can fall on my butt and still make it work. And I think experiencing that on stage and also experiencing the wonderful community of theater and support, it made me the person who I am today.
So what was it like being a high school student and having these professional opportunities? Did it ever get in the way of your schoolwork?
I was blessed to actually be homeschooled at the time.
Oh,
and
nice.
yes, yeah. And to me, I always loved the idea of being homeschooled because it expanded my worldview. And it enabled me to interact with people of all different ages, all different backgrounds, and all different sexual orientations and gender identities. And so I love the fact that as a high schooler, I didn't have the high school experience. I was sitting down next to a gentleman and his husband. And so in learning about their experience and learning about their perspective and understanding that the world was so much more vast than my one lens or my peer group's lens. Mm-hmm. And I think it was such a joy of experiencing the diversity and just understanding that the world is from all different perspectives. And how can I learn from the experience of others?
You know exactly how a conversation is going to flow because you really hit on my next question, which, you're absolutely right. The theatrical community celebrates diversity and inclusion. And you mentioned you were talking to a man and his husband. So were there any other experiences that you had where you learned about other perspectives?
Oh, definitely. I think, the funny thing kind of growing up and sort of seeing the dichotomy is I grew up in a church situation as well as a theater situation. And so to me, I never had the desire to push church on my theater friends. I always had the desire to push what I was learning from theater onto my church friends. Because I'm like, how can we open up people's eyes to understand, okay, this is what love looks like. This is what it means to actually truly engage in community and conversation and have equal respect for one another. And so I think it really shaped my worldview because it gave me that glimpse of this is what it means to be family. This is what it means to actually have friends and support and community. And I saw, because of that theater experience, I saw the great lack of what was happening within the church community.
So when you saw a disconnect between diversity and inclusion, how people should be treated and how everybody has a different background and different perspectives, you experienced a disconnect from all of that from the church setting.
Absolutely.
Is there a moment that stands out to you?
I think for me, it's been so many different moments. I feel like I've never had a hope for the church. I've had a hope to actually have interfaith conversations. And that's what I've loved about my experience of being in New York and having that community. But I think for me, it was just a journey of over time of seeing how my friends were treated. I remember one experience really speaks to me. In the early 2000s, in the late 90s. So I'm dating myself in high school. And I remember having this like really cool metal Bible. And I thought I was such a badass for having it. And there was this guy next to me and we were pit singers. And he turns to me and he pulls it out and he goes, "Oh my God." He's like, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." And he told me his story of trying to sort of find his community, trying to sort of find, his faith perspective and what he believed, and being completely shunned, kicked out of his house, kicked out of the church. And at that moment, I realized I'm like, there's a huge problem. But I didn't have hope that the church could fix it. I had hope of trying to figure out how I could actually create a community that people were searching for, whether it be, those that were Jewish, those that were Muslim, those that were Christians, that they weren't finding in their faith experience of how could I personally create a community of all different diversified faiths and non-faiths and be that safe space for people who would never feel welcomed entering into the doors of a sanctuary, a temple, or a mosque.
How do you handle the backlash from church members who don't agree with your perspectives?
I've gotten a lot of hate mail from it.
I can only
Yeah,
imagine.
I've lost contact with a lot of relatives, a lot of friends. But I think, as I mentioned before about the theater trains you to be 100% who you are and supports you in that. And I realized from my experience, the more that I spoke out, the more that I realized that it was a conditional relationship amongst my relatives, amongst those that were conservative, of saying that, well, I'll accept you on the basis of if.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that, wait a minute, I'm not losing friendships, I'm gaining freedom. And it helped me to really sort out that journey of understanding if they don't like my speech, if they don't like my stance on inclusion, then I'm speaking about life and death situations. I want to make sure that those that are my friends and family who are LGBTQ do not get persecuted. The idea of transgenders and how many murders have happened. To me, it's almost like I am very pro the Equality Act because of what I've seen, because of what I've heard from people in my life who have spoken to me. And I'm willing to lose temporary and fleeting friendships for the sake of speaking up and speaking the truth.
You're very strong in your truth, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us today. And I really like following you on social media. Before we go further, because it's so easy to just get right into the thick of this, I just want to do like a quick fire round of questions. Really, I'm just going to ask, can you define some of these terms, starting with diversity?
Oh, great question. Diversity, and I heard it really well, and it was a woman who worked in the executive level at Uber. She said diversity is not, the idea of diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And so I think diversity and inclusion have to have that marriage between them to really actually create change. So I would say diversity it's connecting, it's listening, it's taking on the stance of a student and understanding that it's fine if your perspectives don't meet, but you're becoming a better person by understanding the diverse thought, the diverse lens of the person sitting across from you.
You could probably speak on this way better than I can, but I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share a thought.
Yeah.
To me, when I heard the diversity and inclusion metaphor as it relates to dance, it's like when you really understand what inclusion means, I feel that the argument that, employers or schools only bring on certain talent because of their race or because of their sexuality or their gender identity, that's being invited to the dance, but being asked to dance is really what we want. That's really where you're going to find where people's best talents lie, right? So when you truly accept the idea of inclusion and you truly practice it, you're going to get different perspectives. You're going to have different ways to problem solve. And as an effect, you're going to have a much better functioning company. You're going to go farther in your university. You're going to be able to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean. And I think I love that you're talking about this because, you look at what's happening with the Black Lives Matter March. And a lot of people who have remained silent or very antagonistic are out there and they're holding the banners and they're standing up tall. And you see a lot of white saviorism. And also you see a lot of tokenism. So instead of actually looking at their policies, instead of looking at the table and seeing, okay, wait a minute, do we have diversity? Do we have people from different backgrounds, different orientations, gender identities, different races making decisions? Or do we have white cisgenders male in most instances making the assumptive decisions and creating tokenism and representation on branding? And that's what I see in a lot. It's painting over the fact. And I think when you look at diversity, and this is what, white people really need to get past. And I speak as a white person. We need to stop whitewashing. We need to stop doing white witness. And one of the things that I see that needs to happen is in order for diversity to occur, I don't speak for people of color. I don't speak for LGBTQ. I create platforms so that I create spaces for them to speak for themselves. And I think if companies and leaders truly understand how to create platforms instead of actually how to speak over people, we truly would see more diversified, holistic companies.
I really appreciate that. A couple more terms I'm going to ask you to define.
Yeah.
These are going to be easier. Anthropology.
Ooh, good one. So anthropology, the study of how people be, the study of how people are. And it's looking at culture from the stance of being a student. And so even going back to the idea of religiosity and religion, a lot of the times it goes for the presumption of conversion, not conversation. And so the beautiful part about anthropology is just sitting down as a student and allowing yourself to experience the full vast of the beauty of a culture that's different than yours, and just standing there without any offense, without any barriers, no uncomfortability at all, and allowing yourself to just sit, breathe, and ruminate on what's occurring and allow it to change you.
Theology.
So theology, in its biggest term, is the study of God. And so, but when you look at theology, I am very much on the idea of progressive theology. And so, but you also have subsets of queer theology, women theology, systematic theology. And so when you look at the difference between, Union Theological Seminary, that's in New York, there, I would say 75% of the people in that theological school probably identify as LGBTQ. Compared to Southern Baptist University, they would have a theology that's very whitewashed, very, cut and dry conservative. And so when you look at the word theology, it's very important to understand the leaning and the idea of the lens by which people see God, because God can really be bastardized depending upon the view that people take. And so I lean more toward that progressive theology because I think it allows for much more conversation instead of kind of a cut and dry ideology.
Right, because theology isn't just about Western beliefs or Western culture, because there's also the Eastern religions. So when you're talking about theology, you got to know what lens you're looking at it through. Sociology.
So sociology, the study of cultures, the study of how people do what they do. So, and it's more behavioral. It's more understanding the sociological identity of people.
And last but not least, ethnography.
Ethnography is my favorite. And so I'm going to give you I'll give you a quick quiz. So when I tell you to describe the word home, what is the first scent that you think of?
Oh, I guess sugar cookies. Are you like literally what is the first smell that comes to mind?
Yeah.
So funny enough, the first thing I thought of was popcorn because I always think about Disneyland. But then I was thinking about my physical, like my childhood home, in which case, for whatever reason, I thought of sugar cookies.
Yeah. So I was invited to an amazing baby shower, and the woman was Kenyan. And so when I thought of all the scents and all the smells, when you think of the word home, it's very tied to your cultural identity. It's very tied to your own perspective. So ethnography is the idea of sort of mixing your senses, of understanding what you see, hear, smell, and feel, and sort of entering into that culture. And so when I speak to someone who's Kenyan, they might think of a food dish that I've never tried before. Or when I talk to someone who's Indian or someone who's Irish, it's like someone who's Irish might think of corned beef and cabbage. It's just this beautiful display of what we consider home. And I think when we understand ethnography, it gives us an understanding of two things. One, it helps me understand my own biases. Because when I think of home, when I think of what it looks like to have faith, what it looks like to interact with people, what it looks like to be a family, a lot of my ethnography is even tied to my generation. And so that in turn makes me much more open to conversation. And it helps me understand someone who's older or someone who doesn't come from that background of what is the world and what is your lens, and how is your experience and your upbringing actually shaped that lens. And then you start with there to bring about change.
I love that we talked about your personal experiences in church and in theater, and then you went on to study all of these different subjects. And I mean, I'm very fascinated because I've got my undergrad in theater. And when you look at undergrad programs, you'll see, you could get a bachelor's in sociology or in anthropology or in this or in that. But, when I'm looking at your background, you've studied all of this stuff. I mean, you've pulled references from so many different angles. It's really, really impressive.
Thank you.
So where did you study your undergrad and what degree did you earn?
Yeah, it's, so, and kind of like going back to your idea where it's almost like receiving the hate mail. That was also part of my experience as well. So my undergrad was actually done through Calvary Chapel. I'm amazed that they didn't kick me. I got almost kicked out, I'd say about 7 times during
Oh my gosh.
my whole time there, because it was the difference between the idea of ethnography and conservative theology is theology is about regurgitating, understanding what a person believes, and then just spreading it out. It's all about conversion. Ethnography is sitting at the table and just soaking up through conversation. And so it's much more open to skepticism. And I would say that's my faith. My faith is very skeptic. I lean on that because I think theology is always evolving. It's always changing. You're always learning. You never get stuck. So my first one was through Calvary Chapel. My master's of religion was through Liberty University. Again, help me God. And my last one was actually through George Fox University or Portland Seminary. And that was my doctorate in leadership and global perspective. And that was, again, it was the first time approaching. All of us came from vast backgrounds, all different denominations. There were lots of affirming people within my cohort. And it was the first time that I'd actually seen faith and culture really being able to collide, and that I hadn't seen in my previous experiences of seminary. And so I say that I'm a pastor who would never step into the doors of a church simply because I would either get kicked out or I would just leave, because of what I've experienced and what I've seen from my research looks nothing like the American church and the perpetuation of hate and bias and discrimination that I've seen. And I honestly don't see a lot of hope for the church unless there's a willingness to change.
Yeah, there's a lot that I did not grow up religious, but when I'm following you on social media and I'm seeing the different things that you point out, I get to experience the world from your lens or from the lens of a churchgoer and see, just the different things that they're experiencing and how frustrating it might be to have this very traditional set of values constantly be challenged in today's modern world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what prompted you to pursue a master's in religion? Like, at what point in your undergrad? Did you always know that you wanted to get your doctorate degree? Or at what point did you decide undergrad isn't enough? I need to get more. I need to learn more. I need to research more.
I think for me, it was twofold. I had always wanted to get a doctorate degree. I was always very type A academic. I always say, like, my first love is books. I'm addicted to books. But I think also too, being raised in more conservative churches, I realized that in order to do anything with this degree, in order to be respected, and I wanted to be a professor, I needed the higher education. Because in my faith experience, I was told that, oh, you're such a lady in person and you're such a online, and from pastors and leaders. And so dealing with this constant hatred and this constant discrimination as a woman wanting to kind of search out academia, I sort of did it in spite. And I think a part of me just wanted to get to the point where I could be a voice to actually call the church on the carpet for the experience that they put me through, but also the experience that I had seen my friends suffer. And so I wanted to make sure that I had a title before my name so that they could no longer say that I could be dismissed as a woman, but I could not be dismissed as a doctor. And in the faith community, especially within conservative Christianity, you are always dismissed as a woman. You're expected to be barefoot and pregnant by the time you're 18. And so that is the only lot in life that you serve, is to be a support system. And so having that fire, I think, within my soul really just led me to pursue it, because I wanted to be in a position where I could almost prove them wrong. And I feel like I am. So I'm very happy that I really went forward with it.
Think about Dr. Jill Biden.
Yes.
Still gets dismissed just because she's a woman. Doesn't matter that she's got a doctorate degree. She still gets dismissed her husband has served as the vice president, now the president. She's the first lady of the United States, and still gets that severe disrespect.
Yeah. I definitely understand that. And I think before I had the doctorate, I was a keynote speaker for about a good 10 years before stepping into consulting. And I remember, simply because I was a woman and also a single woman, the assumption was, oh, you're doing this as a hobby until you find, your future husband and have a family. And it was the idea and the permission that I could be disrespected simply because of my gender. And so for me, I got so tired of being in that subservient role, of being dismissed simply because of my gender identity. And where I do feel like as a doctor, and I can understand Dr. Jill Biden, where it's like, I thank the fact that she stood up for herself. And she's like, look, I've worked hard for this. You put in hours and hours and hours to get that thesis done. My own thesis was 50,000 words. And I had to have 350 sources to back up my thought process. And it's just the amount of work that it takes. She should be bragging about it.
Yeah, you should too. And I'm really glad that you did just throw out all those numbers. That's like as if I wasn't already impressed by you. I just can't imagine that. As a woman who is in traditionally male-dominated industries, I'm on like construction job sites, or at least in spaces similar to that. And I tend to be the only woman. And, I just realized that sometimes it doesn't matter how much you've accomplished. It doesn't matter if you've got education or certifications. Somewhere, someone is still going to hate you. Somewhere, someone is still going to just disrespect you. And it's sad, but it's also kind of liberating at the same time. Like, there's nothing that I can do or say to make certain people see the world through my perspective. And it's liberating because I just don't have time to be held back like that. Do you have thoughts like that when it comes to like
Yeah.
I've never received hate mail. And I'm a type A person. I would just, my anxiety, oh my gosh, it would hurt so bad for a day, probably, maybe even a week. I don't know. What was that like? How'd you find your strength to stand in your truth and just to keep doing what you do?
It was lonely. I would say it was severely, severely lonely because when I spoke out, I mean, I've always been very kind of like the loudmouth. But when I really spoke out and I started writing and started kind of like putting it out there, the weirdest thing is the biggest hate mail that I received was from women, not men. And so for men, they respected the fact that I knew my mind. It wasn't emotive. It was more like we could agree to disagree. For women, they were threatened that I was stepping out of the gender role box. And so I'd say like the amount of friends that I have as men way outnumber the ones that I have as women. Because for women, it was always like, well, you can do this, but don't offend. Here's the script. Here's what you need to read. You're never, unless you're married with children, you are not seen as holistic. And I think and I just had to let that go. To me, I've had to learn to sort of connect with people on Facebook. I mean, even like you, where it's like just connecting, never met you before. We've never sat face to face, but just how do I actually create a community based upon my values, based upon my belief systems now? And then how do I be healthy? And that was my biggest thing was this word for this year was liberation. And I'm like, I wanted to do no matter what I did this year is always make sure that my relationships, my friendships, the people that I surrounded myself with, I could truly be 100% myself. And if I wasn't, then I was almost in a sense creating self-abuse for me. And I realized that I needed to be in an emotional state of health. And it's almost like to hell with everybody else. But it was liberating. And some people have come up after the fact where I've really let those relationships go and they've grown in their own journey and they've come back and they've realized, well, wait a minute, like now I want to converse with you. Now I really want to figure out, why is it that you believe what you believe? Why did you, deconstruct in many ways? And it's been exciting for me, but I had to leave that toxicity in order to be 100% myself.
How do you create an emotional state of health for yourself?
Yeah. Oh, great question. the biggest thing that I've been doing, and two tactics that have worked for me, that I wasn't exposed to when I was young, is the idea of guided meditation has been life-giving. I think, as you were saying, you're type A. I love being productive. I love kind of like sitting down, crossing off my task list. But there were so many moments that I wasn't being introspective. And I realized that I was just drained. And so taking 5 minutes and just kind of centering myself in the present, realizing what's going on, realizing kind of like how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, and accepting that, it's been able to really help me to be grateful for where I am in the journey and not strive to the future. And then the other thing that I've done is I've started to journal every day. I use this thing called Elegant Excellence Journal by Hilary Rushford, and I adore it because it really helps me figure out, where do I want to be in 10 years? Where do I want to be in 3 years? And once I picture myself in that position, it's almost like a vision board. Then I figure out that I'm not going to be willing to put up with the deterrents that get in my way to get there. And so it helps me be much more focused and much more emotionally healthy because I'm realizing that every single step that I'm taking along the journey will get me to the goal that will make me personally happy.
I love that. How do you know that you're hitting a wall?
Oh, good one. I would say the biggest thing is to understand, that's helped me, is to understand my Enneagram and to understand my Myers-Briggs. Because I can either hit a wall in two ways. I can either turn to being a workaholic and everything looks good, or I can just be bawling. And I'm not a crier. And so understanding where it's like when I hit that wall of just exhaustion and overwhelm, but I think I also look at that situation and say, okay, why do I feel like I'm hitting that wall? Have I not created enough support systems? Do I have friends that are draining the time out of me? Do I have tasks that are really not necessary, but I'm doing them just because I feel obligated to? So if it's a stance of, is this bringing me joy? Or do I feel guilty if I don't do it? I always choose joy over guilt.
And as productive people, I think it's really easy for us to take care of all the easy tasks first because we're getting more done. Whereas if you do the most challenging task of the day, and then that's the only thing you accomplish for the day, it feels less empowering at the end. It feels like less of an achievement. But that's not true. Those are just the thoughts that highly productive people might have prior to accomplishing the most challenging task of the day or of the week. So I can totally relate with you right there. So your research is all-encompassing and thorough. How do you avoid personal bias in your research? A not so nice way that I could ask this is how do people know that you don't just have an agenda and only believe what's convenient to you? That you're not only picking resources that are convenient for what you are trying to convey?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I remember where someone's like, even like going through the doctorate, where someone's like, sources. You had to understand what good resources were. To me, the best way that you can do things is don't start out with your opinion. Start out in the stance of learning and understand personally that you come with your own biases. And so even for me, going into consulting, going into diversity, my bias was, in a sense, I had an anger and bitterness toward the church. And I realized that I owned it because of my personal experience. And so having to understand, okay, if I am consulting a faith community, or let's say I'm consulting a rabbi within a synagogue, how do I actually leave my bias at the door and deal with it, acknowledge it, but also understand that how do I listen? How do I approach this? So the first thing that I would say is acknowledging your bias, not ignoring it, but acknowledging it. Secondly, I would say come into the stance as a learner, interview people, where it's like when I was writing the thesis and I was writing about transgender and LGBTQ, I wasn't going to make an assumption as a cis female and a straight person. I just wasn't, because that would have done a disservice to those that were truly dealing with what I needed to speak about. And so I set up interviews and I said, look, I'm an open book. Please tell me, like, no filters. And so having that time and having that ability of sort of saying that I'm a blank canvas, paint me and help me understand your perspective so that I can truly actually create a more inclusive environment. Thirdly, I would say then look at journals. And so if you're looking to actually figure out your own bias or figure out, a new genre of study, always look at journals first and then look at news media. And then look at the authors of that news media, where it's like, where have they been published? Do they have their own bias? What's their perspective? What's their backgrounds? And so it's almost like a funnel of starting at bias, starting at interviews, sources, and then looking at the media.
That's solid. That's solid advice for anybody who may be working on their thesis currently. Do you have any advice for students who are thinking about doing graduate school?
Yes, I would say do something that you love, because 90% of the time you'll feel like quitting. I can remember when I was doing my thesis, I would just be in tears and I would want to like throw it in the fire. I would say 9 out of 10 times, because you always feel like it's exhausting. It's tiring. I mean, as an extroverted person who wants to sit there all day and just write these facts and figures, do something that is dependent upon your joy, but also do something that will make a difference in the world outside of you. And allow that. When I was getting really frustrated, I wouldn't think about changing the agenda or changing the conversation. I would think about creating a better world for the faces. And once I realized that I was creating this work so that my friend could have a better life, so that my family member could be in a room without feeling like they were going to be persecuted or abused or murdered because of who they were. And so making sure that it's always for those that are closest to you. So don't be pushed by the agenda. Don't be pushed by creating a bestseller, but be pushed by the faces, because it'll get old after a while. You really will feel like quitting 9 out of 10 times.
During the 1 out of 10 times, what faces did you see? Whose faces did you see?
Good question. One of my good friends was, he's trans male. And he said to me as I was interviewing him about the thesis, and he said, when I think of faith, when I think of Christianity or the discrimination that I've experienced, he said, all I can think of is the song that people sing, Onward Christian Soldiers. And he said, Christians are always fighting after someone. And he goes, I'm tired of them fighting me. And I'm like, whew. And I realized I want to create a world where people are no longer fighting people, where the others are actually joined into community, where they're not cast aside, where they're not segregated, where there is no more white supremacy. And what would that look like? And so that, as well as hearing stories from my friends who have been discriminated based upon the color of their skin. And so realizing, what would it look like, and who's to blame, and then how can we actually change the narrative? And so I would say that was the biggest thing, of going back to those moments of time, going back to the experience of the people that had spoken to me, and realizing that if the world was different, would their stories have been different?
Take what you learned from today's expert and play. You heard me? Go play. Just try something new, because that's the best way to discover your passion and purpose. If you found the episode insightful, give Industry Explorers a 5-star rating and tell us what you learned in your review. Subscribe to Industry Explorers on YouTube for more adventures. Industry Explorers is made possible by the support and contributions from explorers like you. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on our next adventure.